Good evening, good morning to Anupama. A very early good morning, I believe, and good evening to everyone. And many thanks to all of you and to the organizers for considering me. I'm new to your organization, and I believe you're some kind of an educational society. Am I right in thinking that? And that you have been. This is number 79, so this means that you're even from many years, you've been conducting these annual roundtable conferences. So thank you for that. I'm a researcher. I work in the field of women and gender studies. And I have recently been engaging in the issue of, I have been working in a number of areas, but in both two areas that I think touch upon the girl child in more ways than one. One is gender biased sex selection. And the other is the phenomenon of early and child marriage. But I thought I would use, and in the context of that work, I have been actually trying to, I believe it's very useful for us when we precisely want to intervene and make a difference. And we recognize, as I think, you have all said, there is no question of the inequalities within which girls and women today continue to have to try and make their lives meaningful. There is no question about that. I think the question then becomes, what is the context within which the problem is named and how is the problem understood? And here I thought I would quickly, since it's a very short time available to me, I thought I would mark three moments, broadly speaking. One is the 19th century. It was alluded to very quickly by previous speakers. The 19th century has always been, and I would say this has been a discovery for me. The 19th century has been called the social reform period. Sati, marriage, widowhood, schooling, the whole issue of schooling and education. And it has usually been called the social reform of women. We have called it the social reform of women. Now, what I found very remarkable is that actually, if you look at the actual campaigns, they were all about the child. It is the first figure to appear in public, in terms of public, was the child widow. It was the child widow that commandeered, this kind of public outcry, the fact that, she could be widowed at such a young age. She may not even have lived with her husband, and what was her future, to be condemned to everlasting widowhood and so on. This was one of the first figures. Child marriage followed from that some decades later. Female infanticide, the fact that a baby girl might be actually killed off after birth because the family felt they could not manage to look after her. And schooling itself, the very idea that a girl could go to school itself, a very interesting history that began with missionaries and other figures, social reformers. A big controversy over whether or not a girl could go to school in the first place and whether this would jeopardize her respectability, her future, and so on. So this first moment, I'm suggesting to you that this first moment is actually a moment we need to redescribe as the moment of the child woman and the woman child. I'm not saying it's the moment, because you see, the idea of the child had not taken root yet. And if you look at existing literatures on childhood, you will understand that childhood is a historical construction. In pre-modern societies, the notion of a child that we take for granted did not exist. Beyond the first few years of life, certainly up till puberty, they were mini adults. So, and much of this has been, there's a lot of research on this question. So even the term child marriage, Bal Vivaha, if you like, in Hindi or whatever, these are concocted words. They didn't exist in our Indian languages. So the idea of a child as a special phase of life that is very distinct from that of an adult, this was a discovery across the world, but it took place in colonial India in the social reform period. And so I'm saying that the woman and the child is a complex figure and this is my first, we need to rethink this history of womanhood in the context of the fact that most of these were what we would today very readily call a child. My second moment is actually post-independence. It's the decades of the 1970s and 80s. it's the decades of development work and so on. And I would, the interesting thing is, you've used the word girl child. Actually, the word girl child itself is invented for the first time in India in the 1980s. It's an Indian invention. It's our word. It was our word. It was used by development economists. It was used by women's movement activists and so on to point to the fact that there is this very heavy inequality. There's this very...
फिर आप जब ज्वाइन करेंगे किसी के साथ मीटिंग करेंगे तो पता चलेगा तितली श्रीवास्तव.
Please mute yourself. Thank you. So it was during this time in the 70s and 80s when there was a women in development kind of concern about poverty, and many of these concerns were very much part of the development issues of the time, that it was found that the extent to which countries like ours had a huge disparity when it came to females, and especially when it came to children, at the level of nutrition, at the level of health, at every level. We had, for instance, at a very young age, we had something called excess female child mortality. Now, I don't know if you know this, but actually in most parts of the world, there is it is actually baby boys who are a little more vulnerable in ordinary circumstances. Baby boys are more vulnerable than baby girls. It is skewed ordinary mortality. If there was no inequality in gender terms, there would be more baby boys suffering from childhood diseases and so on. But we were one of those countries where the opposite was the case, where the mortality rates were skewed against girls, right? So, and this was then added on to later in the 1980s with the discovery of sex-selective abortions and sex selection, which, by the way, was not a rural practice, it was an urban practice. It was a practice in non-poor, middle-class households, that there was, sex-selective abortions taking place when a fetus was discovered to be female. So the missing girl child, this was a very, very significant figure that came out in the 80s and 90s, thanks to the work of women's organizations and subsequently health people. So the endangered girl child, the girl child as suffering from undue health risks, undue social risks, was a term that came out of India. It was picked up then by UNICEF. It's very interesting. If you look at UNICEF reports, you will find that they were just talking about the rights of the child till about the 1980s and early 90s, after which they picked up the idea of the girl child, and you will see reports using the phrase girl child for the first time. So this endangered girl child is a second moment in my account. And I'm jumping, I know because of lack of time, I'm jumping now to the late 20th century, early 21st century. And I'm being a little controversial here because I am saying that the girl child then becomes an international figure, one that is picked up by all kinds of agencies, the World Bank, international agencies, the state, the government, NGOs, and so on. There is a kind of large-scale concentration on the girl child as a very significant figure to help secure the future of the country. So I'm being a little controversial here because there is not a significant focus on the boy child. If you look at World Bank studies, there is a special focus on the girl child, and within that, a special focus on the adolescent, that is the young teenager, as requiring all the focus of developmental efforts, especially education, in order to solve the problems of society. And I've written about this in my own writing. So the belief was that if you put the existing resources in the current, what some people call the neoliberal kind of culture, where an economy where the willingness to put in enough financial and infrastructural and state level support and resources was becoming down, the belief was that if you focus sufficiently on the girl and her education, then other problems will also get solved. And my doubt is whether that would happen or not. You need to have, in order for all the issues that have been raised by my predecessor and so on, if the girl is to get her rights, if she's supposed to have the kind of space in society and the equality that she needs, she will need more than just a focus on her education, retention in schools, and so on. She will need a larger household context within which there is adequate nutrition. She will need a context of employment within which, after her years of schooling, she can expect to find some kind of secure work prior to the decision as to whether and how she should marry. The marriage question has come up recently in terms of age at marriage. And here too, my concern is, what are the choices available to any woman, whether she be underage or above the age of 18 or 21? What choices does she have in a society like ours? And will just the focus on education alone achieve this? So my third figure is this somewhat problematic focus on the girl child and her education, as though this alone could actually solve the kinds of crises that we are in today and the inequalities that we continue to have. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to have a discussion later. Thank you very much.